So obviously, we've already seen Woodrow Wilson really as the third progressive president with Teddy and then Taft and then Wilson. And we know that Wilson was the son and grandson and nephew of preachers. In many ways, really saw himself as divinely inspired, in many ways, divinely driven. Much of that idealism came from really a religious sense of right and wrong. So when you look at Woodrow Wilson as well as William Jennings Bryan, they both saw themselves really as promoting American democracy and Christianity around the world. And Woodrow Wilson himself saw himself as being directed by God to help people create a new world order that was governed by morality and ideals rather than national self interests. So we're going to have to see that in the context of what happens when the Great War, as it was known, it's not World War One until there's in fact a second war starts. So the Great War starts in 1914, and over a period of 4 years, it would cause 20 million military and civilian deaths and more than 21 million more wounded. It would take out old monarchies, it would destroy old empires, it would create new nations, and unfortunately set in motion a series of events that would lead to World War II. So we've got to think about how it starts, what happens at home during the war, and then how the war ends and what controversy is generated about that. So the fighting starts in Europe with a guy named Gavrilo Princip, and he's a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist. He wants Serbian independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he shoots and kills the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, which is capital of Austrian Bosnia. Now, you don't need to know about all the dynamics of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but you do need to know that in many ways it was an aging empire, an empire that was made up of a bunch of different groups and sort of hard to keep together. Now, to avenge the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, okay, with Germany's support, seeks revenge on Serbia. So now you have the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians together against Serbia. Well, Russia mobilizes to defend Serbia. So now Serbia and Russia against Austria-Hungary and Germany. So you're going to have a group called the Central Powers, which is going to be made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy later on, versus the Triple Entente, more well known as the Allied Powers, France, Great Britain, and Russia. Yes, Serbia is technically part of it, but they're so small it's not really relevant. So Germany thought it could achieve a quick victory, and so it had declared war on Russia and then France. But then Germany invaded neutral Belgium, and poor Belgium. We're going to see that in World War I and World War II, and it brings Great Britain into the war. So again, these alliances that had tied countries together, when someone ended up going to war, everybody sort of came to the party. Now, when the war starts way over there in Sarajevo, and then, again, the dominoes sort of fall and other groups are involved, Woodrow Wilson quickly says, America is too proud to fight, okay? And that namely, it's so far away, we have nothing to do with it, this causes can't touch us. And he tells Americans, listen, I want you to be neutral in thought and in action. Now, again, being neutral in action is one thing. Asking people to be neutral in thought is completely different. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson wasn't really neutral in thought. Privately, he wanted to make sure that the United States could provide Great Britain, our longtime ally, yes, fought him in the Revolution, fought him in the War of 1812, but really our cousins, our British cousins, and France, of course, who had helped us through the Revolutionary War. He wanted to give them as much financial aid and supplies as possible. And then you've got the American people who really have a hard time being neutral because more than a third of Americans at this point in 1914 were either first or second generation immigrants who were still loyal to their own homelands. Of that, you've got 8 million German Americans and you've got 4 million Irish born Americans. Now, again, the Irish hate the British. Again, so it's going to be people who would be on the side of the Central Powers by virtue of either being, pardon me, born or having relatives in Germany, and then being Irish. And then there were many million Americans of British origin, again, not surprising, going all the way back to 1607, who supported the Allies. Now, you've got to think about who benefits from this war, particularly from remaining neutral, and that would be American businesses, because exports to to Great Britain and France quadrupled in just 2 years, from 14 to 16. And the Allies need loans from U.S. banks and are getting quote unquote credits from the U.S. government that will allow them to pay for purchases later on. Now, the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who is a very idealistic guy. Take back to what we saw in 1896 when he ran as a demo pop. He also ran in 1900 as a Democrat. He didn't like the idea of loans to Europe because this is not in the spirit of true neutrality, he said. Now, Wilson disagreed with William Jennings Bryan, and he actually removed restrictions that Bryan had put on loans to these warring nations. And American banks and investors will eventually send more than $2 billion to the Allies before the U.S. enters the war, and only $27 million to Germany. So technically, they gave money to both sides, but far more to the Allied forces. And William Jennings Bryan said, we don't do this because as we give more and more money and supplies, and the Allies are buying from us, it'll be really hard for us to remain neutral, which in fact was the truth. Now, technically, even though we were giving financial assistance so much more to the Allies, the Wilson administration maintained official neutrality for 2.5 years. And he was particularly adamant about freedom of the seas. And he believed that the United States needed the freedom to trade with all nations at war, even if we were trading disproportionately with one side over the other. Now, obviously, freedom of the seas has been a cause for much tension with Europe, going all the way back to what was happening in the 1790s up, and then obviously to the War of 1812. And so early in the war, William Jennings Bryan is going to urge these warring nations to respect the rights of neutral nations to ship goods across the Atlantic, okay, without violence. Now the Central Powers agree, but the British, who were supporting, they refuse. So in November 1914, the war is only a few months old, the British order the ships of neutral nations to submit to searches to discover if these cargoes are going to Germany. The British are strong enough to basically demand and say, we want to know what's going there, and we're going to stop you from getting it there if we can. And then the British announced that they would seize any ships carrying goods to Germany. So now you have the British really making this first move. The British blockade forces Germany to really go unter sea, or under the sea, because they cannot compete, with the warships on top of the sea. So the Germans declare a war zone around the British Isles, and their major weapon is U-boats, submarines to attack ships, but they declare that it might not be possible to save the crew and passengers. This is important because prior to this there had been a long-standing wartime custom of stopping an enemy vessel, announcing we're going to shoot on you, allowing the passengers and the crew to board lifeboats before sinking it. So in the past, boats had been sunk, but there'd always been with a certain amount of decorum and chivalry, and people weren't going to be killed. Now, the U.S. called these unrestricted U-boat attacks an indefensible violation of neutral rights, and Wilson warned Germany that it would be held to quote-unquote strict accountability for any American lives and property lost. Well, then on May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat sank a British luxury liner called the Lusitania, with nearly 1,200 people aboard. About 10%, or 128 of them, were Americans, and they died. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, again, not the president, but still quite famous, calls this mass murder and urges an immediate declaration of war. Woodrow Wilson, much like Thomas Jefferson had done back with the Chesapeake and Leopard affair prior to the War of 1812, calls for patience. And he famously says, there is such thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it doesn't need to convince by force that it's right. So William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of State, demands that the Germans stop this unrestricted U-boat warfare and that they apologize and pay for the families killed on the Lusitania. Germany counters and they say that ship was armed. It wasn't. And they also said it secretly carried rifles and ammunition, which was true. Almost every ship that was going back and forth across the Atlantic during this time had some sort of rifles and ammunition on board, but the Germans used that as a pretense to say this was a legitimate attack. Woodrow Wilson dismisses the German claims, but William Jennings Bryan is sort of so annoyed that it seems that Wilson is so obviously on the side of the Allies and not truly neutral that he resigns. Now, what's interesting here is after the Lusitania, Germany did tell its U-boat captains, stop attacking passenger ships, but a German sub does sink another British liner called the Arabic. And only 2 Americans are on board, but again, American lives are lost. So Germany quickly pays a cash penalty to the families and says, listen, we'll make the Arabic pledge that says liners will not be sunk by our subs without warning, without safety of the lives of the non combatants, assuming that the liners don't try to escape or resist. So now you have this promise. But then the U boats sink a French passenger ferry called the Sussex, a very un French name actually, killing 80 passengers and injuring 2 Americans. So Wilson threatens to end relations with Germany, and the German leaders say, okay. And they renew their promise not to sink merchant or passenger ships. The Sussex Pledge, more than anything, implies basically the virtual abandonment of unrestricted U boat warfare. So, okay, what we have happen after the Lusitania with Wilson is that there's an effort made by people at home to quote unquote sort of prepare the country. Now, prior to even the Lusitania, Teddy Roosevelt and a major Republican senator, Henry Cabot Lodge, had started a preparedness movement, and they created something called the National Security League to convince Congress and Wilson to begin preparing for war. But even after the Lusitania, Wilson doesn't want to go to war, but he is going to direct the War and Navy departments to develop plans for $1 billion military expansion. What's important to note is that there are many Americans, pacifists, progressive, non interventionists, who are opposed to this quote unquote preparedness effort because they think it's just a blind money grab for defense industries, quote unquote war traffickers that make weapons and other military equipment. And they say, you know what? Who does this benefit except for major, weapons makers? Nonetheless, despite the opposition, America does pass what's known as the NDA, or the National Defense Act, which allows the Army to grow from the 90,000 that it is to about 220,000 men over the next 5 years. So war hasn't been declared, but there is an allowance for the military to grow bigger and bigger if it needs it. Now, famously, in 1916, Woodrow Wilson is going to run again. Now, obviously, we know in the 1912 election he beat Taft, he beat Teddy, and he beat Debs in a close election. Well, in this case, he runs against a very, very moderate Republican, Hughes. Teddy Roosevelt wanted the nomination but didn't get it. And the major campaign sort of slogan he uses is, "He kept us out of war," which is going to be interesting because as soon as he gets narrowly elected, because California is a very, very close race but puts him over the top, he actually does get us into war. So he won on a promise to keep us out of war, but unfortunately 1917 changes everything. So after he's barely reelected, Woodrow Wilson is going to urge the warring nations again, like negotiate a peace and be done with your war, but that's not successful. And so at the end of January 31st, 1917, the Germans are desperate, and they make a desperate move, and they basically reinitiate unrestricted U-boat warfare in the Atlantic Ocean. And so effectively all vessels that are going from the United States to France and Great Britain can be sunk without warning. Now, Germany really underestimated American, power. Germany looked at the United States and said, "You basically have no army. You've got very few weapons. You've got very little transportation. You've got very few airplanes, and you lack really all other instruments of modern warfare." And that's true because the United States hadn't had to fight in any war. Don't count the Spanish-American War as sort of modern warfare. So, as a result of this resumption of unrestricted U-boat warfare, Woodrow Wilson is going to end diplomatic relations with Germany. Now, that's not a declaration of war, but it's getting there. And then 3 weeks later, the British intercept a message from a German official, Arthur Zimmermann, to Mexico that basically says, "Hey, if we end up going to war, could you invade the United States on our behalf? And in return, when we win, we'll help you recover lands that were taken from you as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo." Cool name. And of course, when Americans find out about it, they're infuriated and they call for war. Could this have ever happened? Would Mexico have ever done it? No, but it didn't really matter. It's just that sort of idea and this anti-German hysteria that's going to keep building. So in the next lecture, we're going to have the United States actually entering the war.